everybody, this is B007 back, not with another 10-minute movie review, but rather with a discussion of Netflix's House of Cards series, which, as you may know, I've been commenting on the episodes as they were released on my blog, but not really reviewing as such, rather just binge-watching and regurgitating some sort of instant comments. So, today I am joined by a member of the Vassals of Kingsgrove, potentially award-winning podcast, huh, Stephen?
Apparently, we were nominated. I don't know when the decision comes down, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going against Serial, so pretty minor challenge.
But actually, probably more relevant to this podcast, you also have a politics blog. Do you want to tell everyone where they can find that and what it's about? And what is an Orange Tory?
Oh, okay. That's
okay,
a lot
in like 1 minute.
In 1 minute. So my blog is theorangetory.blogspot.ca. The Orange Tory is a term I captured based on a political term in Canada called a Red Tory, which I'm sure also exists in the United Kingdom, of kind of a progressive person who's in the Conservative Party. Tory usually means conservative. But in Canada, the furthest left-wing party, the New Democrat, is an Orange Party. And I, in my political realization, switched between the Conservative Party and the New Democratic Party, which is a social democratic party. So instead of being a Red Tory, switching between liberals and conservatives, I switched between socialists and conservatives until I kind of found my groove later in life.
See, the fact that you can keep all that straight is why you're perfect for the House of Cards blog and the House of Cards discussion. But I guess the other reason why hopefully you're better qualified than me is because you know more about the American political system, even though you're not American, because Canada is a proud and sovereign state.
Yeah, I should be clear. The blog I write mostly focuses on Canadian politics, but also urban and economic and social issues. Mm-hmm. But yes, being a Canadian and being a political nerd, I'm quite familiar with the American political system.
Excellent, good. So you can explain anything I don't get. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus mainly on Season 3, which was dumped in one go about a month ago now. But obviously we might talk about the rest of House of Cards and maybe even the UK version, which was its inspiration. And some would argue it's better. So how did you watch it? Did you binge watch Season 3? Or did you kind of, slowly take it in?
I tried to slowly take it in. I think the weekend it came out, I watched 1 or 2 episodes that Saturday, and then I watched a couple on Sunday, and then basically maybe 1 or 2 during the week, and then finished the rest on the weekend. So I spread it out as probably over a 10-day period.
But that's still intense though, right? For 13 hours of TV. It's kind of interesting that the benchmark now is for such concentrated viewing. Like I watched it all in one go, basically. So it's amazing.
It really is problematic. I find the Netflix delivery system forces the viewer to either binge watch or kind of decide you either watch it whole hog or you have to pull it aside for a later time. There doesn't seem to be a nice middle ground of, oh no, I decided every Sunday I'd watch an episode just like it was regular TV. There doesn't seem to be any permission for something like that.
But we can do it, right? I mean, it's all self-imposed peer pressure. I don't know how that works, but there's no reason why we couldn't watch it 1 episode a week.
Absolutely not. I think part of the issue, though, comes in the fact that the zeitgeist moves on away from House of Cards so quickly. And given the nature of the show, there's usually a dramatic conclusion or end point to each season. So all someone has to do is, utter the phrase like, Frank became the president. Well, congratulations. Season 2 is ruined, even though that was clearly where it was going anyway. Yeah. Right? Because that's the final 15 minutes.
Thing. Okay.
It is a bit of a spoiler thing, but there's also the fact that you can't participate in any of the coverage because it's not being gated off to the whole audience.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
So I can't read your blog freeform whenever I want without digging through the archives or it's not like, oh, it's Sunday, so I'm going to watch the new episode, then I'm going to read what everyone's writing on social media. It's at any point someone can tweet and it'll throw me off, which is how this conversation actually started.
Yeah, absolutely. So I apologize for that if that was me.
No, you were fine.
But I think it is interesting, and I wonder if the format of it will hold up as a repeat viewing. because it does feel to me it's designed for that intense binge watch. And sometimes I feel there are individual episodes that are a little bit lacking. Whereas maybe if you do have to watch it once a week, you need to be, I don't know, is tighter the right word? But there are definitely episodes that feel to me more like a holding episode, or a kind of plugging in some backstory or some setting up story, which you wouldn't get away with on a weekly serial, I think.
Right. It's with House of Cards, it is incredibly difficult from my point of view to discern where one episode ends and where one begins, even when you spread it out over time, right? Because the show is this through line and there are major points in the story, but I couldn't tell you if it happened in episode 2 or episode 6 even sometimes. Like it becomes a stream of consciousness. And sometimes, like you say, I wonder if the creators and the managers behind the programming say, like, this allows us to tell long form stories. And at the same time, you're right, hide the episodes where the budget wasn't being put on full display, or where you're just setting pieces for the next big story point. Because a person's not going to remember a weak episode because they're immediately just going to press play, or more accurately, the app is just going to play the next episode immediately for you.
Which I always find quite insidious. So, do you think it's sort of, can you tell when different people are directing episodes? Like, I'm just thinking that we kind of know each other through Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, where there's a lot of hype if it's an episode that's directed by D&D, or if George has written it. And there are episodes in House of Cards which are written by Beau Willimon, or which are directed by James Foley, or particular people. Like Jodie Foster did one, I think, in season 2. So, do you think? But I can never tell. Like in retrospect, I'm thinking to myself, can I tell which episodes those are? And I'm not sure I can. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it just shows that there's such a consistency and overall tone to the series that people really stick to those guidelines. Or maybe it's a bad thing, because that's kind of one of the distinctiveness of a lot of other shows. Like when people spot, John Slattery directed that episode of Mad Men, let's see what that's like, kind of thing.
I think the visual language of the show is very strong, and it's been very difficult for directors to break out of that mold. And because you watch it, and I actually really like the opening title sequence, I find myself actually watching that go by. It forced me to acknowledge who the directors were in each episode more often than I probably would be aware of. I noticed in particular in season 3, Robin Wright directed at least 2 episodes. It might be 3 or more. So when I noticed that, I tried to pick up if Claire was being presented in a different way in those episodes. But like I say, I have such trouble distinguishing the episodes because of the format that even those nuances, I think, get lost in this like tidal wave of content.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, definitely. So overall then, do you feel that you can even distinguish the seasons from each other? Like, does it even make sense to try and, rate the seasons or rank which one you like more than the other, or do they just blend into an overall oeuvre?
I think the seasons are much more easily distinguishable because of where the characters are in each season. So, to lay it out bluntly, we have season 1 where Frank is a congressman, and at the end of the season, he ends up vice president, right? So that's season 1. So then season 2 is him being vice president the entire time until he becomes president. And then season 3 is his presidency. So the structure of, if we're following Frank on his political journey and his career, are structured very clearly, though I'm not sure if they paid that off in season 3.
Yeah, well, that should, we can totally get to that. I mean, I was kind of thinking of it to myself today, and I thought, in retrospect, I always think of season 1 as my favorite because I loved the sort of the character of Pete Russo. I thought he was a truly tragic figure, and I loved Corey Stoll's kind of performance as Pete Russo. But actually, I found the ending of season 1 really frustrating. So I kind of think of it retrospectively as probably better than I did at the time. Season 2, I kind of was maybe less impressed with, but I really liked season 3. But you had some issues with season 3 and the ending, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's initially what triggered this conversation. I think season 1, you can kind of cheat and say the premiere of season 2 almost belongs more with season 1.
Exactly, and that was my only criticism of season 1, is that it didn't end. And then when I got that first episode of season 2, I was like, oh, okay.
Here's perhaps my main weakness as a critic of this piece of content, and I'll be upfront about that. I am informed greatly by the BBC's presentation of House of Cards. So I'm interpreting it through that lens a lot of the time. When I look at Frank Underwood, I can't help of Francis Urquhart. And when I watch the show, especially the season structures, when my mind backs away and I think of how they're approaching this as a creative team, I can't help but contrast, the 3 seasons of House of Cards England and House of Cards America.
But has that become easier for you, though? I mean, to distance yourself? Because I think it's a bit like watching Game of Thrones, where the first 2 seasons I was really close to the books and really I got so angry when things were different, whereas by the 3rd season I'd approached a zen state of calm, that they were just different things. And I think season 1 I was always thinking, oh, Zoe isn't Matty and Frank isn't as evil as Francis, and it's just not as good. Whereas by season, I think it just becomes, it felt like once Zoe had been killed, so that Matty storyline was over, they were very different, and there was so much longer form as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've had this discussion, or sort of hinted at it, where I'm not sure that 13 episodes, 3 seasons could sustain that level of evil that Francis Urquhart had. Do you know what I mean? Like it just worked very well in that sort of short, I can't remember how many episodes it was, maybe 3 episodes per season, but very short.
4, I believe.
Yeah, short, sort of concentrated evil. I'm not sure you can sustain that over 13 episodes.
So when I look at season 1 and I contrast it to the 2 season 1s, and you lay them side by side, and I should first address, no, I can't separate them. I look at them and I'm not saying, hey, this character doesn't line up with this character, therefore it's inferior. I think Zoe is a very good example of an ambitious American journalist. And Maddie represents something that maybe is a little more of her time. Like the depiction of women matters in this, and what would this look like in this setting? Sometimes when they did throwbacks to the original story, Zoe alluding to Frank as her like a father figure, that felt out of place. And it felt like they were just doing it.
Because I think Zoe just wasn't sexually alluring. I mean, she didn't look... With Matty, you could tell that Francis Urquhart was in danger because she was very alluring. And no offense to the actress playing Zoe, but I just never felt that chemistry. As much as there was a huge age gap between Matty and Francis in the BBC one, there was definite sexual chemistry, which I never got from Frank and Zoe, but maybe that's just me.
I think that's a bit of the casting, and then it could be miscasting, or it could be...
I feel Zoe was miscast.
Yeah, so Zoe, to me, her and Frank her relationship is much more of a ambitious, power-driven, and they're throwing their passions into their own success, and they're using each other, and that kind of drives it forward. While Maddie approaches Francis as this doe-eyed, vulnerable girl who appeals to Francis's desire to protect and care for her. Well, doe-eyed
and vulnerable, but I mean, sexually fetishizing him, right? I mean, there was something almost sinister in her calling him daddy. There was something very unwholesome in that relationship,
right?
Which I don't think she was unaware of, in a sense.
Right. I just find that we're talking about different things. So when you're integrating the old BBC stuff, it's like, this doesn't. You're not fitting this all together, and I'd prefer to look at it as, hey, they're both getting what they want out of this relationship. And then, later in season 1, Zoe isn't getting what she wants out of the relationship, but Frank is still kind of getting what he wants. And problems.
I guess I just never bought it. And I never bought... I mean, if you want to talk about sort of the closing of season 1, although it's really season 2, I never bought her being killed on the metro track. I was just like, CCTV, anybody? Maybe it's just a problem of transposing a murder to modern setting, where it's just harder to get away with it. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, the conclusion of Zoe's character, at least it gave us that really good scene where at the end of the season 2 premiere, where Frank finally addresses the camera again, which that's an entire facet of the show that I think season 3 abandons to its great fault.
Mm.
The fourth wall breaking is much less in the third season. So we're relying upon, speculating to what's going on inside Frank's head. And when we do get inside looks, it's too grandiose. We're not the fun of House of Cards, both American and British, in my opinion, is we're going along for the ride, passively helping our villain main character succeed.
Absolutely. We want the whole point of House of Cards BBC version is that we hate Francis, but we love him. And there's a malicious glee in seeing him win. And I don't know, do you think that the fact that they didn't use the voice to camera sort of conceit maybe reflects the fact that, I'm not sure if they acknowledge this, but really it's Claire's season 3? Or it felt that way to me. I don't know if it felt that way to you. It felt that her journey, her emotional journey towards divorce was actually real, where the real drama was. And all the political stuff, like the Russian president and the hostage thing in Russia and all that was just kind of, it all reflected her journey and her disillusionment with Francis. In a way, I almost wanted her to speak to camera in season 3.
I read that on your blog about how this is,
maybe it's because I'm a girl. Moment. I don't know.
Here's my problem with that. That's what we weren't promised that in the show. So as a viewer, I'm watching this political drama about Francis Urquhart and his wife Claire, yes, but it's always been about like their personal ambition to obtain power.
Mm-hmm.
So, and one of my issues with the show is...
And their interlocking ambition to gain power, which is even more interesting.
One of my problems is that perhaps the show has been too subtle, and perhaps I'm not a sophisticated enough member of the viewing audience to understand. Here's a great example.
But you're Canadian.
That's, proud and noble nation that we are, even this level of subtlety can elude us. For example, there's a scene where Claire confronts Francis in the White House kitchen, their personal residence, and he asks something about, "Are you hungry? I'll make you a sandwich." And she says, "No, it's just after the UN thing."
Mm-hmm.
And then at the close of that scene, she cracks some eggs into a frying pan. And I don't remember exactly what you concluded, but I think you said something in your blog post about, they're inseparable from each other and the eggs represent Frank and Claire. And to me, I'm like, how the hell am I supposed to get that? Like, as a viewer, I'm listening to this dialogue where, Frank has decided to support his wife in her bid for having real tangible power in government. And then she starts cooking eggs, and there's like a close-up on the eggs and Claire's face, and I don't know what any of this is supposed to metaphorically be communicating to me.
We've never seen her cook before. And I think a whole lot of that, without sounding facetious, a whole lot of that first half of that season, before it starts really going off the rails for them, is about, in a sense, her supporting him and almost becoming like this maternal figure who's getting him to where he needs to be. And I think I wrote about that with there's a very weird sex scene they have early on in season 3.
Oh, yeah.
Where she kind of, like, he's morose and depressed and deflated, and she sort of basically like pumping him up with a bicycle pump, but she kind of fucks him back into being. And it's a totally unsexy scene, but she
almost horrifying.
Yeah, she observes what he needs, and what he needs at that moment is kind of a sense of not so much gratification, but of feeling virile. So she's going to give him that. And I felt that in a way that was the scene with the kicking it as well. It was just like, this is the one time we see it happen, and it's her thinking, right, what do we need? We need a show of unity. I need to put myself in that position of float as a first lady, where I'm going to be that conventional, do whatever it takes to get the president kind of like, she's a kind of like a 360-degree fluffer. She'll do whatever it takes to get him ready. And that's kind of what I took from that first half of the season. So when they have this kind of crisis point and she says to him, "I should never have made you president," that to me is the total turning point of the season, because we've seen her really subjugate all her, well, not subjugate her ambition, because at the same time she's been trying to do the UN thing, but really taking on all these kind of female subordinate roles that she thinks he needs at that point, and then realizing it's for naught because he's not the man she thought he was.
So perhaps your point there highlights my problem with this season, and I will willingly put on the line that, as a heterosexual male, perhaps this is lost on me, but looking at this season and looking at the show overall, I do not see Frank unfairly using Claire more than Claire uses Frank. It's not one of those things where I think in season 3 they try to hype up the fact that Claire is the charm offensive for Frances, that she can go in the room and everyone finds her much more pleasant than Frank. But in previous seasons and previous episodes of that, they had showed Frank has this down home kind of charm that, people kind of take pleasantly onto themselves, that he's an appealing figure. He's just kind of unknown to the American people. He's not vilified. He's not hated or anything like that. And Claire needs Frank's position to achieve her own ends. So it's not as though she's not getting something out of this arrangement. They kind of have a symbiotic relationship with each other going forward. They both need power. They both need each other to achieve it. And Frank makes this point to Tusk in season 2 in kind of a ridiculous fashion. I believe it's to Tusk, where he says, he's the vice president of the United States, which is, in terms of American politics, one of the most minor positions, unless the president dies, which gives him constitutional power, which is way more important than money. So Claire, it's like, yes, you're his rock and you're his loving wife and you support him through all these problems, but he is the president. I think they make this point in season 3 at some point. Like, there's only at the end of the series, actually, where, there's only one chair. One of us is president, the other is not. So even though Claire has been supporting Frances, she's done nothing to build her own career parallel to him.
Well, isn't that's the crisis? That's what to me makes season 3 feel very interesting. So, to me, seasons 1 and 2 is the story of a marriage that just works. It's odd, but it works. It's equal, it's respectful, it's kind of loving in its own bizarre way. And it's about two people who I think genuinely do love each other. Like, they do care. You see the episode where Claire reveals that she was raped by the army general in season 2, and Frank looks outraged, and in fact it's Claire who makes more political capital out of it than he does. And I think it just works. It's kind of like an evil but good marriage. And I think something fundamentally changes when it gets to season 3 and suddenly he's president. And I think the crisis in the relationship is what you say about that final line about, it's wonderful, isn't it? The brutal fucking truth, without me you are nothing. This office has only one chair and you knew that from the beginning. I think the problem is that when we get to the start of season 3, Claire she knows it, but she doesn't truly take it on board.
Right.
Like, I still think she thinks it's the equal partnership, which is fine when your husband's majority whip or vice president. But once he's president, that's just like a category error. Like, something has qualitatively changed now. And that old deal doesn't work. Like, no matter how many things he throws you, like, okay, in season 1, he throw you the money for your charity, or throw you the sort of UN nomination, which he does, turn over backwards to try and give to her.
Yep.
Nothing like that. It's never going to be enough to be the counterweight to what he has. And maybe it's kind of trying to reflect, I don't know, like, is it a comment on Hillary and Bill Clinton? Like, it's just, you can build your careers, and she did build her career. She built up a very successful nonprofit, but she's never going to be president. And therefore, it shouldn't be surprising, I think, that the marriage comes to an end when he attains that goal, because she can't go with him to that place.
I think you've summed it up nicely there, where the president, Frank touches on this at various points in season 3. He has historical and constitutional and legacy concerns that he has to think about after he's not president anymore. America Works is a hugely controversial program.
Works. So funny.
Oh, God. We can talk about that in a minute. But a person who just wanted to be reelected and achieve power wouldn't touch it with a 100-foot pole, right? There's plenty of other ways to kind of muddle along as real life American politicians have and politicians all over the world, where you take the easier solution of least resistance, small policies that make incremental change that are much more popular than this kind of radical reform idea. Like, why does Frank tackle this? And I think there's actually structural problems in how the show was portrayed that lead to more problems with this. But all in all, he has bigger concerns than his relationship with his wife and their ambition. And ultimately, it seems as though Claire is the more ambitious of the two. There's in the very first episode of the show in season 1, when Frank fails to become the Secretary of State, it's Claire who's the incensed one who's like, you got to figure this out, Francis. We have plans.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's, in season 1, she was the one who was, using the Sandcourt money and like derailing Frank's bill because she needed to get her way with the NGO. And in season 2, when she reveals the rape, she is the one who actually really goes on the offensive and exploits it politically first. So I think you're right. I think the problem is that in season 3, she's as ambitious, if not more so, but it's thwarted ambition because there's literally no outlet that can match his. And that, in a way, I feel she's being unfair in a way. Like, she's holding him up to, she's asking him to fulfill a side of their joint bargain that he can't possibly fulfill.
Right.
So I sympathize with, I love Claire in season 3. I think she becomes really, not that I love her, but I think she's so fascinating as a character. But I think in a sense, at a fundamental level, she's just really unfair to Frank. But I don't know. Do you think they're in love in season 1 and 2? Do you think they're in love in season 3?
When they get remarried in season 3 and Claire redyes her hair and they kind of reconnect with each other, to me that almost reaffirms that this isn't just politics for at least half of this arrangement.
Right.
I think Frank, again, I might be approaching this as a man watching this compared to how someone else might view it, but Frank does seem to adore Claire.
I agree.
When he says things in the show like, I feel bad for having married Claire because she doesn't, like, I don't deserve her. I think he's sincere when he says things like that.
I agree. I think he admires her tremendously.
Right. At the same time, Claire's relationship with Frank is much more problematic. I believe in the show, at least in the timeline, she's the one that has stepped outside of their marriage more than once and first.
Well, in the context of the show, well, that's true. We've seen her sleep with the photographer, but then he slept with Zoe. They've had some threesomes.
Following that, he sleeps with Zoe. Yeah. But
maybe we should just describe it. Maybe they're equal opportunities cheaters, aren't they?
I suppose, but
I would say that maybe Frank slept with. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Vina.
I think the difference is in what we've seen in the show, because maybe they've cheated on people otherwise, but from what we've seen in the show, Frank cheats on her with Zoe to further their aims, whereas Claire sleeps with Adam Galway just to sleep with Adam Galway. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could interpret that as meaning that he cares about her more.
And Frank doesn't appear to have any kind of emotional relationship with Zoe.
No.
Right?
No.
And he doesn't have a follow-up relationship. He has his unrequited love with his former student at the Sentinel, his fellow former colleague at the Sentinel, right? Like that's Frank's thing, but that's also just Frank being a man of his age and of his time wasn't able to follow up on maybe what he wanted. He couldn't have what he wanted then and whatnot. But Claire, he still loves her dearly, etc. But when we get Frank alone, he's often saying that he loves Claire, and I don't think that's politics or him performing for somebody. But when Claire is alone talking with someone about Frank, take the gay activist in the Russian jail cell, she does not speak flatteringly of her husband, or silence is often saying a lot more than words could in those scenes. True.
And yet, I think maybe it's that not that she loves him, but I think in some way she believes in him, and I think that, and in fact, the Russian gay the American gay activist Corrigan's a really interesting turning point, I think, in season 3, because obviously when she goes rogue on stage after he's committed suicide, that's the first time that she's done something that damages them or damages Frank politically. But there's also a sense in which when you watch her watching the Russian president and Frank decide how to spin the death, she seems to just sort of, not snap is the wrong word, it's too trite, but that's when she seems to, if not fall out of love with Frank, then kind of lose faith with him. Like this is
disillusioned.
Yeah, this is one step too far. And I think maybe if he loved her, he could forgive her a lot of things and does. But because her attachment to him is far more rational, like he was the guy who was, she respected him because he was smart and he was going to get her where she needed to go. But maybe it's easier to break that kind of respect than actual proper love. I don't know.
Here's one of my issues with this, and I think Frank even makes this point, which I should probably be disturbed how often I'm agreeing with a faux semi-tyrant. Claire's not a very good politician.
No, she's not.
She is, I think, to say the least, undisciplined. And at several points in this series, not just this season, she speaks out of turn or undiplomatically, ironically, because she becomes a diplomat. And it puts things into a major crisis. The Sandcorp thing, sabotaging Frank's efforts. Like that could have been a serious misstep. The rape allegation she makes against that general. It's like that could have gone really badly.
And announcing that she'd had an abortion and everything.
Yes. We all know diplomacy. Western countries often have a very fanciful notion, or their citizens do, of what diplomacy is, which I think this season did a good job of showing what Russia's interests might be from a foreign policy lens, and American interests very poorly. It's not all sunshine, and sometimes it's about swallowing bitter pills to work with regimes that are otherwise abhorrent. In an ideal world, you might turn their governments into smooth glass. But we don't live in that world, and you have to work with people. And sometimes lying about how an activist died in a jail cell so you can move towards some bigger diplomatic goal is better than speaking the truth, as awful as that is to say.
Absolutely. So I think in a way, her sin is not being self-aware. It's like Frank is, I always feel very, very aware of his strengths and weaknesses, whereas Claire, I think, thinks in a sense that she's better than she is. Like her sense of entitlement to that UN job at the start of season 3 is utterly nauseating, especially when you see her go through the committee hearing and just failing horribly. And you just think, oh my goodness, the gap between what you think you are and what you think you deserve is so wide. And the fact that Frank doesn't tell you this till right at the end of season 3 really does go to show his love for you, because he must be able to see it. And I think there's that interesting moment, isn't there, in season 3 where he takes her into the whatever they call the room where you go and see the situation room, maybe, where you go and see the kind of the drone attack, and he's showing her the high cost of when you have political power, the tough decisions you have to make. And he's kind of trying to very subtly tell her, do you really think you're up to this? Without actually asking her to her face. To that extent, he is the better man, so to say.
Well, he's a politician, right? He's practiced and trained, and as much as I'm sure British society is much like North American society, as much as we deride and shame our politicians for being politicians, like it's a job about making important decisions, and diplomatic ones, and ones that are saleable to your constituents or the nation as a whole. It's not just about doing what's right all of the time, right? And we see when politicians kind of, the ones who are always banging the drum about what's right. Like if you had a politician who spoke as Claire did, they'd be kind of this fringe person in their political party who was always arguing against their own party, let alone, the other ones, about their high moral ground that they've established. It's like, well, that's wonderful. Glad someone here is banging the drum on those principles, but some of us have to do the business of governing, right? Like compromise and sharing the load between differing opinions.
Exactly. Governing is not running an NGO. It's not a single issue politics issue, right? So I don't know. Anyway, let's talk about AmWorks.
Let's talk about AmWorks. Bina, you're an economist, sort of. Do you want to tell us about AmWorks a bit? Or your thoughts
AmWorks isn't
first?
AmWorks is just about raising FEMA funds to create back to work programs, basically, like government sponsored jobs.
Uh,
So
I, I wouldn't characterize it. That's how it becomes presented when Frank doesn't get his way. But what it seems to be is a massive program to restructure entitlements away from, here's government money to here are government sponsored jobs using those former sources of revenue.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I decided to nitpick policy on this one.
Yeah, but I mean, basically, it's not the key point for me as an economist is that he's not funding ongoing commitments with ongoing revenues because the FEMA money isn't ongoing; it's a stockpile for a rainy day. So
Mhm.
it's a fundamentally fiscally unsustainable program, unless I'm getting something wrong, which I might be because I don't really understand how FEMA funding works.
FEMA funding, again, this is getting way too deep into the weeds, but it's block funding approved by Congress, and it's kind of represented in the show how if a hurricane comes, the Congress like here's an extra 5 billion, you do what you got to do. Like it's
Yeah, that's why I didn't really understand the whole thing of, oh, we're now going to be unprotected when there's, these weather events that are, like extreme. And I was like, well, why wouldn't they just give more money? I mean,
well, the Congress tries to blackmail Frank into
yeah, but I mean,
signing
like
it,
fundamentally,
getting
they're not
approving
going to
that
not do
money
that.
to reverse his policy decisions,
So,
etc.
so my question to you is, do you find that credible? Do you find any of it credible?
Ah,
Because I tell you from a British perspective, the British, or my kind of slightly uneducated perspective is that whereas British politics tends to be very it swings on a pendulum because we have incredibly concentrated power in the hands of the Prime Minister. So you tend to get radical government followed by equally radical government, but in the opposing direction. So in the
yes.
British context, something as radical as we could have a Prime Minister very openly saying, nakedly saying, you know what, I hate poor people. I don't think there's any such thing as society. I'm going to kill welfare handouts, and I'm just going to basically use it all to create jobs because I believe in the power of the individual. So AmWorks could happen here, and it wouldn't be unusual. But it just felt to me like in an American context where everything seems much more contested and conflicted and harder to get things done, and you can't be as
Mhm.
open about the naked political hues of what you're doing. And it just felt to me like, would this really have happened? It felt like a very Francis Urquhart policy and not like a very Frank Underwood policy in a way. But I could be getting that wrong.
One of the weaknesses of Americans' House of Cards could be the fact that there's almost no politics in it until very late, and then the politics become very radical.
Yeah.
Like Frank's politics are virtually unknown to us as viewers until very late in the
I
game.
honestly
He's a
didn't even know
pragmatist.
which party he belonged to. Like, it hadn't even registered to me whether he was a Democrat or a Republican up
I
until.
think they're forced to reveal that in the second or third episode of season one. I don't think it's even revealed in the first episode. He's just the whip.
Mm.
But hmm. So in a policy sense, the AmWorks program almost reminded me of the guaranteed annual income plan, which is it's a policy idea that's gaining some traction. Where instead of having a massive list of welfare programs and social assistance and whatnot, you set a number that everyone in the country is guaranteed to receive. So $20,000. Everyone in the country is going to receive that, and if you make more than that, great. If not, we'll top you up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an effective way to fix that. Maybe that's what inspired this policy idea, but that's way too abstract a policy. So instead, it's much more of a Keynesian, kind of massive make work scheme by ironically removing Keynesian social safety net programs. But an annual income would also take care of things like old age pension and
Okay.
whatnot,
Yeah.
because it replaces it with everyone's going to get $30,000 or $40,000 a year anyway. Doesn't matter if you're 80 years old or if you're 18 years old, which means you can work as an artist and still get a certain amount of income, or you can be a student and get a certain amount of income, or you can be retired and be guaranteed a certain level of income.
Mm.
Still, Amworks is super confusing, and I think it's nice how they portray it in the media and in other characters talking about it that no one has any idea what it is, because it's almost like a MacGuffin of here's this big controversial idea. Frank just wants to put people back to work. Why do you want to stop him? Which I think, if I may, I think there's a huge problem with the structure of the American House of Cards in that is not mirroring its British counterpart.
Okay.
And that is, there is a period of time where Francis Urquhart is prime minister and immensely popular as leader.
Yeah.
Right? So he's devious and underhanded and literally a murderer, but his public persona is very well liked.
Which was imitating Margaret Thatcher, right?
Right.
In her first 1.5 terms.
Yes, we all know how Margaret Thatcher secretly had members of the press murdered. That was a joke. Oh God.
But then if you ask certain, I mean, she's incredibly unpopular now, right?
Yes.
She was always incredibly unpopular with certain elements of people who would not hesitate to believe that of her, even though, you know, I'm the last born Thatcherite, so I definitely don't.
I understand. Again, Canada also has a similar swinging political system. Westminster system has a habit of doing that. But the Frank doesn't get any honeymoon period. And I thought season 3 would have been much more interesting if you had Frank being challenged by an institution outside of government, but he's either been reelected or the congressional elections just ended and there's huge majorities for his party and his programs that maybe are dubiously constitutionally based or something like that. So it's, he does develop tyrannical elements, but instead
is there precedent for that? Like, I mean, is there a sense in which Veeps who inherit power don't get that kind of typical post-election euphoric honeymoon period? Is that realistic?
So the best example for that might be Johnson, who
but then
inherits...
that was following the assassination, I guess. That's
yeah. So he was immensely popular and reelected with a gigantic majority, the largest majority a Democrat has ever received in American history, if I remember correctly.
But Gerald Ford, no.
Gerald Ford, no, because he was coming off the stink of the Nixon years and whatnot. But, Johnson gets reelected easily off the sentiments around the Kennedy assassination, vice presidents that follow. The problem with Frank is that he has no political capital.
Right.
He's not seen as legitimate.
Which is weird.
And so I almost wonder if Netflix should have cut him some slack. Like, go to 4 seasons. Have season 3 be here's Frank is immensely popular. Maybe he's fighting with the Supreme Court, which, are challenging decisions that, Congress is happy to vote for, et cetera, which actually would nicely mirror Francis Urquhart's fight with the monarchy. It's like, here's this body that is kind of politically untouchable, but, can cause you a lot of problems if you have issues with them.
Actually, yes, I've never thought of it that way before, but I think that's a really good point, actually.
Yeah.
And actually dramatically, I was at the time quite surprised at the unseemly haste with which he went from becoming president to then fighting again for his presidency. Like, he barely had to pause for breath. And you're right, a series this patient, that's an obvious cash cow for Netflix. Why not you've got the time, just spread it out a little bit more.
And it hurts Francis because we're used to meeting him as this competent, able schemer. So put him to war against a political opponent that he can't just easily beat, like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, right? Going for the foreign policy angle, I think, is boring. Because, yeah, of course the American president has limited leverage with the president of Russia. Like, we've all seen this story before. Have the president fight with the Supreme Court.
It was also too similar to season 2. It almost feels like who's going to be the big bogeyman foreign policy person of the season. So, we've had the Chinese, we better have the Russians, and next year it'll probably be the North Koreans or something. It's too lazy in a way.
Mm-hmm. And it just wasn't particularly interesting, and it robs the audience of what they want to watch, or at least what I, as a member of the audience, want to watch, which is Frank being witty and cunning and scheming, and instead we see him, constantly being hemmed in because what most presidents come to realize is that the presidency is actually not particularly strong. They are the most notable part of the American government, but actually one of the weakest branches aside from the kind of extra executive powers they operate with.
But then is that the weakness, the fundamental conceptual weakness of translating House of Cards from Britain, or indeed a place like Canada or Australia, where the Prime Minister has a lot of power, to America, where the President doesn't? I mean, if the whole point of House of Cards British version is this juggernaut to the top, because when you're at the top of that House of Cards, you command everything. Where, I mean, does it just not work in an American context?
Absolutely. It's the fundamental flaw, and there are reams and reams of thought piece essays and articles out there that anyone can find about how the American system was constructed to be slow moving, adversarial, and obstructionist. That the voices of the minority had to be adequately heard before anything could happen.
Checks and balances.
Checks and balances. Like we come from Westminster countries, where when Parliament decides to do something, it happens. Laws can be passed in a matter of hours, if need be. Americans can't do that. Like that's not how their system is structured. Even in emergency situations, I think it actually comes up in House of Cards when they talk about give me a clean bill for funding for FEMA. It's like that'll take days. It's like that would take minutes in Canada if we needed emergency funding.
Exactly.
Like
In
that
England, you just call a cabinet meeting and you get it done. We
right.
push through, you 3-line whip it, it's through that night.
That's right. And for the President of the United States has this terrible political problem of there's only one president. So they appear imperial in their stature in American politics. But the reality is they don't have the power to match it. And and a lot of times in America's history, like a small group of senators often operate more political power because the Senate is a difficult body to manage. So, you get things like the group of 14 a number of years ago, moderate Republican and Democratic senators that kind of were responsible for ushering major pieces of legislation through. It's like, well, yeah, you had to appease those people to make anything happen in Washington.
Okay, so controversially, given that this is a fundamental conceptual flaw, would they have been better off closing the series out, at the end of season 2? Like, is the real business of House of Cards USA is the interesting, dramatic part of House of Cards getting Frank to achieve the presidency rather than being the president, in which case season 3 was always going to be a bit of a flop dramatically, politically, and that fundamentally when we now look at season 4, the business of season 4 will be getting him elected to the presidency once more, and that they should fundamentally close it out at the end of season 4, having not done so at the end of season 2. Can this series not work politically dramatically when he's president? And given that they can't have another election after the end of next season, that has to be the end of it.
I think the problem there is, based on that theory, none of the crime rags to riches movies or television series should work, right? Where you have this guy, and the most interesting part of those stories, at least in my opinion, and I'm sure many people's opinion, is that scrappy, brutal climb to the top of the pile, right, to become the kingpin. And then comes the dramatic fall, right? You attract too much police attention.
Of The Sopranos, right? That the period when Tony had gotten rid of like his mother and Uncle June and everyone, and he gets to sort of unabashed power. There's kind of like a couple of seasons before the final season where it is just a bit like treading water.
It's dramatically change is more interesting than stability. To pull in a little bit George R.R. Martin here, he talks about, we're told Aragorn is a great king because Tolkien says so, but what was his land reform policy? Like the process of being in power often isn't very dramatic. Yeah, no one. It's very difficult to make that interesting unless it's a challenge, unless there's something happening, which is why I think season 3's fundamental problem is Frank appears to be behind the 8 ball the entire time. So we're just watching a person failing. There's not even a decline. It's just everything's going wrong for him right from the start.
Yeah, and then the final kind of knife in the gut is when his wife leaves him, which really makes me wonder how season 4 is going to play out. I mean, for him to come back from this and win the next election is going to be a miracle. Is it going to even be credible at this point?
Is season 4 confirmed? I thought they were going to stop after 3 seasons. I could be wrong.
What, you mean this is the end?
I think this might be the end.
Well, that's just a really rubbish end. In which case,
okay, so
season 2 should have been the end. Definitely.
So that was my understanding, which is also why I find it deeply unsatisfying.
Oh, that's why you were freaking out and so disappointed.
Okay, freaking out is strong. But okay,
you sounded perturbed on Twitter. You were not happy.
An embarrassing little side fact. So again, one of the problems with these shows is it's dangerous to go on the internet. And I saw an image of Frank Underwood lying on a floor, like covered in blood. And I'm like, oh, so he does die this season, just like in the BBC one, which is why it's the last season. This makes sense to me. So I was kind of destroyed by my own expectations of like, so when does he die? Like, when is this? Like, is it in that kitchen in the White House that Claire just loses it and hits him?
She hits him over the head with a saucepan full of eggs.
You know, he hits his head on the side of the marble counter and it cracks his skull and he just bleeds out, and that's the end of Frank. Like, or he just has a heart attack because all this stress he's been under, the poor bastard. And it doesn't happen. So then the soft ending of, the big dramatic and conclusion is his wife leaves him because
compared to death, that's going to be mild.
It's like, this is really uninteresting conclusion.
Do you think you would have found it uninteresting even if you hadn't set yourself up for a murder?
Yes, because I would have assumed it was coming anyway. Because I've watched the BBC one. So, and I think the ending of this, the tension there is not good enough at the conclusion.
You see, I thought that final episode was amazing. I thought it was a masterclass of choreography within an episode.
But it always feels like Claire is about to leave him.
In the final episode, but actually it was very will they, won't they up until then. There were always hints from the first episode, but at the end of each episode I was always like, but their marriage is so strong and they're so committed, and I don't know, to me I did feel dramatic tension. And then the final episode, when you go kind of through the phases with her, I thought that was really interesting. I mean, I want another season because I want to see what Claire does next.
This is a big question.
Do you want another season? Because we've both enjoyed it.
So here's my question.
We've enjoyed
what are they
it,
going
right?
to do with it?
Yeah, okay.
I think the trajectory, there are certain changes that have happened in season 3, like, for example, the loss of the turn to the fourth wall and talk to the audience. I didn't write it down or anything, but it feels dramatically reduced from previous seasons.
Well, it was never as big as it was in the BBC one, which was always a disappointment to me. So it is less, but it was always lower.
Season 1, they definitely play it up a lot. Like, there's just so many times where Frank is, quirks an eyebrow at the camera or has some southern metaphor that he wants to deploy that I'm sure no one from South Carolina has ever heard before to, prove his point, to sound fantastic. And then we just lose it progressively as the show goes on. And we become divorced from Frank as the character. So I don't know. And Season 3 made him very unlikable because you're right. If Season 3 is almost putting it in the perspective of Claire, then it's hard to like Frank after, kind of the horrible things he's said to Claire towards the end of their relationship. It's hard to repair that. That damage with the audience, not just his wife.
See, to
me, do you find him likable at the end?
Yes, but for all the wrong reasons, because I'd always missed the malicious Francis Urquhart, and so seeing him piss on his father's grave at the start of season 4, and then the scene in the church where he's basically, throwing a fist up to God, and then the crucifix falls. I quite liked all that kind of like over melodramatic, malicious moustache twirling stuff. And
sometimes that stuff felt a little bit too heavy,
and I don't know. I think I'm very invested in the emotional relationship of Frank and Claire. I'm fascinated by their marriage. I think it's a kind of marriage we don't often see on TV. You see perfect sitcom marriages and you see bad cheating marriages. This is a very weird one because they hurt each other profoundly, but I still think they kind of love each other, and I want to see where that goes. I think the problem with season 4 is the politics will be utterly uninteresting, because he's so in a corner and he'll have to do dirty deals and do stuff and become elected president. So the end of season 4 is going to be the same as end of season 2, effectively, except that it's through a general election, not through the withdrawal of a current president. But so it's a weird one. I almost didn't want season 3, but now I've had it, I do want season 4, just to see what happens to them.
I'll be honest. If it comes out, I'm watching it.
Yeah, evidently, right?
I mean, there's not enough good political fiction of any kind in any medium. I'll take what I can get.
Yes.
But like I say, I feel like the show mishandled season 3. Like, this should have been Frank's triumph. You know, I would have had him, because he's the vice president, he was never elected. So he could have served out the rest of Garrett's term, been elected, and then elected again, just like Harry Truman did, I believe. Please forgive me, merciful historians, if I got that wrong.
Don't worry, I don't think the listener's a historian.
So you could have, like, hey, he's really popular, because the end of season 2, they show, like, Frank is this breath of fresh air cleaning out the Garrett garbage, right? You know, he's commanding, he's taking the situation in control, and it looks fantastic. Like, this is going to be great. But there's no win. Where is the payoff for all this hard work? And, you know, on the one hand, as we've discussed in this conversation, the American presidency isn't a prize. You know,
I mean, maybe that's the point that Finch is making in Beau Willimon. Maybe that is the fundamental pedagogic point that they want to put forth to the viewers of Netflix, that this isn't a prize. Maybe this is an incredibly subversive show at the expense of its dramatic arc.
You know, that there was a cliche very popular around the 2008 election where after the last vote is tabulated and they declare the winner will ask for a recount, because walking into becoming the president in the face of the financial crisis was, who wants that, right?
Well, like, there was a very famous Onion headline, which was, you know, along the lines of the only time we'd let a black man become president is when shit was so fucked up we wouldn't, you know, no white man would do it, kind of thing, which I think is kind of also true.
Fantastic. You know, there's actually a trope that, or some analysis that shows women become leaders of political parties when the parties are either in crisis or on the verge of crisis.
Well, true of Margaret Thatcher, certainly.
Yeah. In Canada, there's tons of examples that I will not bore your listeners with. So, you know what? You could be right that the presidency, as much glamour as we aspire, you know, heap upon it, you know, in international circles and for the American domestic audience, is actually kind of a dummy prize. Like, the people who become president work at it for decades of their lives in many ways. But do you actually want it? Is it a very satisfying job? You know, like,
and that's the problem, isn't it? That the only kind of people who'd want that kind of job, knowing how impotent they would be, but just the fact that it's just a stage for your ego. They're not the kind of people you want doing the job. It's the old catch-22.
It's the job with perhaps the greatest amount of responsibility and proportionally the least amount of authority.
Absolutely.
Right.
And yet none of them enact constitutional reform in the wake of that, which amazes me. And they further have to tie their hands with the lobbying money they take in. And it amazes me, the US system, it really does. But sadly, I don't think House of Cards is shedding any light on that system. Or maybe it is. Maybe it is, because he can't do anything. Maybe this is a much more clever show than we think.
So is House of Cards shedding light on the American political system? I think they have done a great disservice to the depiction of the American Congress. You know, they did a little bit with it early on, you know, that it's individual personalities.
I feel like in season 1, the passing of the education bill, they showed a little bit of how things are horse traded. And that's kind of gone away a little bit in seasons 2 and 3.
Yeah, and season 3, it just becomes this kind of boogeyman adversary to Frank of amorphous interests. And in many ways, that's kind of how the Congress is depicted in American media. It's like, hey, there's this body that never gets anything done, and it's all full of craven, horrible people. Don't you hate it? Like, yep, okay, fair enough.
So
That's
do you
basically
think
it.
House of Cards is political cliche rather than being politically subversive? That it's just
Uh,
utterly mainstream in its depiction of Congress and politics?
hmm, I don't know. It's hard to say, right? Because you're contending with the cynicism of the viewing public, and they're very willing to look down at their politicians. So it's a little bit hurtful that House of Cards isn't the show. They're not the ones to shine light. Like if you want an optimistic view of American governance, watch The West Wing,
Yeah,
right?
true. Which is
Where
why I didn't
people are
watch it, because I hate that kind of political fantasy stuff just does not float my boat. I'm much more in the darker, more sinister aspect. So, I'll watch the thick of it rather than Veep because I find Veep too kind of cuddly in its view of politics. So, yeah,
um,
what can I say?
yeah, it's every politician there is only out for their own interests compared to The West Wing, where everyone's opposition is usually framed within some sort of policy disagreement. They actually have values or ideology that is framing their disagreement. Uh, I don't know.
Okay.
As for the American presidency, I think it's interesting to show the American presidency as or the American president as ineffective. But then it becomes a question of, is that the product of Frank Underwood's performance or of the American system? And I don't know if they.
Have a view either way.
Right. There's a really great episode of The West Wing where, in the fifth season,
Oxymoron.
settle down, Bina, where President Bartlett meets with several former presidents on a flight to another former president's funeral. And the way they have this collegial back and forth with each other
Hmm.
about, like, this job sometimes. And I almost wonder if it would have made sense for Frank to have a moment with that, like have someone he could talk to openly
But
with.
he doesn't have anyone he can talk to openly.
And that's another problem in season 3. Like they bring back Freddie for, 12 seconds of screen time. And Freddie's conversation with his grandson about whether or not young black man can become a politician is also really interesting. Um, there's no one for Frank to talk to, and he's not
Yeah,
talking to the
because Doug
audience
Stamper's off being psycho and blackmailing people. Seth Grayson's just weird. Um,
with his eyeliner.
oh yeah, okay. So let's just do a small interlude segment where I just ask you random shit that's been puzzling me and see if you can answer it.
Oh, terrifying! Great.
No, you might not know. That's fine because I just haven't figured it out. So I just thought maybe I'd missed something.
All
So,
right.
but these are all totally unrelated. Number one, do you think Tom Yates, the biographer, did he really turn tricks in college, or was that just a way to kind of try and elicit a response from Frank in terms of him confessing his bisexuality?
What I thought that scene did more than anything else was I love that thing about basically Frank is looking for the boyfriend experience, right? He just wants someone to talk to. He's a very lonely man.
Yeah.
And that gets compounded by the fact like Claire doesn't share her bed with him anymore.
Hmm.
And Freddie, he had to distance himself from Freddie in season 2 and Doug is in recovery as far as Frank knows. And I can't remember his secretary's name, but even she was this kind of competent person in his life that he could turn to and have, at least in my imagined expanded fiction, conversations with.
Hmm.
And now he seems so utterly alone. And the fact that he is a lonely man who just wants someone to talk to, and there might be that sexual element to it, like I found that very compelling. Like it's not the
I
sexual part
agree.
that was
I
interesting.
agree. I was just like wondering how
Did he do
clever
it?
Tom Yates was. Like, is Tom Yates offering himself to Frank because he knows how lonely Frank is, and this is a way to make his book better, or is Tom Yates genuinely bi? Because it felt to me like he would be a much more interesting character if it was a kind of deliberate, corrupt ploy.
Right.
But
I
I
think
just
Tom
couldn't
is
figure it
telling
out.
Frank that he knows who he is,
Mm.
right? That he recognizes what all of this is.
Okay.
And it becomes very clear, the sharing of the drinks and Frank's like desire to have an intimate relationship with him. Like it's all just and very confessional. Like it all makes a lot of sense to me. And whether or not Tom Yates did it, I kind of assume everything Tom says is true. He seems so cynical and relaxed. I know that's the wrong tack to take, especially in the show, but I'm inclined to believe it.
Okay, interesting. Secondly, you know, Jackie Sharp has that weird poppy tattoo
Yeah.
that she gets extended in season 2. What the hell's that about? Did I miss that?
So if I remember correctly, the number of poppies represents like it's either people she has killed because she was in the military or some sort of infraction she's done. It's a form of like penitence that she has. Okay. So when she gets another tattoo, it's after she destroys the career of that congressman that she was very close with.
In which case, my God, if you're in professional politics, how many tattoos are you going to get?
Well, I personally don't think tattoos are very professional looking, so none if you want a successful career in politics, but that's just me.
Okay. That ends my random question segment.
I thought there was going to be like a dozen, so I'm suddenly very relieved.
Well, no, there are. Well, yeah. I mean, I think those are the two kind of season 2, 3 ones. There are other smaller ones, but that's okay. We can go back to more season 3. Judge Jacobs, Heather Dunbar. Were you convinced? I mean, when I first sort of got to see Heather Dunbar, I just thought, really, you're going to be the villain against which Frank faces his comeuppance? She didn't seem to have enough credibility or heft to me. What did you make of her? I find it telling that we're now like an hour into this podcast or over an hour into it, and we've yet to discuss the main antagonist. Unless we're assuming that the main antagonist is Claire this season.
Ooh. Well, I think Frank almost has too many antagonists, right?
Yeah.
Petrov is an antagonist.
Jackie
Congress
Sharp
is an antagonist. Jackie Sharp is an antagonist. Dunbar feels more like opposition than an antagonist. I thought that she is an interesting characterization of who would be against Frank. But Frank hasn't done enough publicly to justify it.
I just felt it was weird to have both her and Jackie Sharp, who were quite similar in some ways. It was almost like too much. I don't know. It felt like they could have been conflated in a character. You could have just had Jackie kind of in some way go up against Frank.
So Heather Dunbar's purpose is to represent law and justice. Literally.
Well, apparently.
Right. Like that's what she is supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
But aside from what we know Frank has done that no one else knows about, you know, the murder of Zoe and, you know, other questionable legal things he's done, like none of that's public knowledge. So this campaign against him from a law and order point of view doesn't make a terrible amount of sense to my mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot about her character that doesn't make sense.
Well, of course, Dunbar also comes out of that bizarre internal investigation of Frank and Garrett, President Garrett, in season 2 with Tusk and the Chinese, and that plot was so muddled you need a sandblaster to see through all that mud. Like, my God, season 2 is a disaster in terms of what the hell is actually going on.
Do they have a political consultant on this show?
So I'm a big political nerd, Bina. I love politics. It is my bread and butter. I write about it at least twice a week and all the time, twice a week on my blog and all the time on Twitter. I don't know why political fiction seems not to be written by people who know and like politics.
Because the strength of House of Cards is that it was written by a political operative.
Yeah.
And if you look at things in the UK like, Armando Iannucci, who wrote The Thick of It, and then Veep in America. Well, I'm not sure about Veep, but The Thick of It, he had insider political spin doctors advising him on real events, which is why it felt so painfully real. And I think that there's a rich vein of political fiction and TV in the UK, which is scarily well informed.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder about this. Like, have they just paid anyone? Like, historical fiction, you would pay a historian. Have they bothered to do that? Is this truly a political drama, or is this a character drama about Claire and Frank?
You start after asking questions, right? Like how informed is this show? Like how much of it is, we've watched the BBC House of Cards. Wouldn't this be great for an American audience who don't understand what the Westminster system is?
Mm.
Let's put it in the American context. and adapt it, as opposed to let's generate legitimate controversies that stem from our system.
Exactly. And so my point is it's almost as though in season 2 they realized that they couldn't quite do that. So in season 3 they shifted the drama really to Frank versus Claire. Like they've almost given up trying to do the politics in season 3, it feels to me a little bit.
So here's a point I would make. The writers seem to, at least at some point, make the correct decision of, we have to draw on history. And Frank in season 3 seems to be extensively borrow from Franklin Roosevelt. Right. Appoints his wife to be the UN ambassador. Literally, Eleanor Roosevelt was the UN ambassador. This AmWorks is definitely supposed to be a reinterpretation of the New Deal. Mm-hmm. Peace in the Middle East is definitely the stretch there. I don't have a nice, clean comparison, but for some reason, American political dramas, they can't pick a single foreign policy issue besides conflict in Israel and conflict with Russia, which boggles my mind. There's 197 countries in the world. The U.S. has relationships with all of them.
Yeah, but you have to have one that people all recognize. You can't have conflict with Papua New Guinea.
No, but there's plenty of conflict, and your many readers and listeners from there. But I think as a major weakness, as soon as I realized this was going to be Frank versus the Russian president, I will admit I rolled my eyes quite a bit.
Yeah, especially when he turned up with a bloody Nordic accent. I mean, that's like the least Russian character on TV this year.
But he looks like Vladimir Putin, so...
He doesn't look like Vladimir Putin.
He looks enough like him for a TV reason.
Vladimir Putin's got a lot more Botox and has a lot more buff.
Yeah, Petrov is a very slim gentleman, scarecrow-like.
He looks like a Nordic prime minister because he's Nordic.
I didn't know that. I just accepted this and moved forward.
Yeah,
my bigger criticism was with the plotting in the writing.
There's a scene where Claire tries to speak French, and that just made me sad.
I'm just nodding my head. As a Canadian, most of us receive some training in French.
Yeah, so, exactly.
American with French words is a secret pleasure / torture that I just enjoy.
So to sum up, is this a political drama in your view? Is it even trying to be a political drama?
I think the show became far too much of a one-to-one adaptation. In season 1, they did really interesting things to Americanize House of Cards and to modernize it from the BBC original. Mm-hmm. But in season 2 and 3, you're getting to a point where you're not even really talking about the American political system, right? Like, what about this is distinctly American? What is the critique of the political system of that country that you get from House of Cards? Mm-hmm. When in the BBC one, it's quite easy to point to, here is, this is the price of having one man have so much sway over government.
Yeah, absolutely.
Shrug. I'm shrugging. But you can't see that.
Okay. I don't know. So I guess I'm coming to the conclusion, and I guess we can come to the conclusion of this podcast, which is that, I've genuinely enjoyed House of Cards. I think it's incredibly high quality. The production design, the opening credits, as you've talked about, are stunning. The acting is just uniformly good. I just feel that it's run into a bit of a political drama dead end, because we're just now going to have yet another election or another race to be president. And so the only interesting thing it can do in season 4 is emotional. And that just feels like, well, it's just a shame, because like you say, there's so little good political drama on TV that it just feels like a wasted opportunity, even though I've really enjoyed it so far, and I'm sure I will enjoy it as and when there's season 4. Is that a fair characterization? I don't know. How do you leave season 3? Like, what would
as far as I was aware, that was the end.
Okay.
And if there is a season 4, I think there's a lot of headwinds that the show goes into. There's just a lot of problems. Like, Frank is utterly unlikable. What do you do with Claire now that she's gone? Like, do we follow her around? And what kind of life does she have?
Okay, so I hate to tell you this, but I've just Googled it.
Oh no.
Netflix confirms that a fourth season of its original House of Cards political drama is in the works and will debut next year.
Was it posted on April 1st?
April 3rd.
Okay.
I Will Leave a Legacy, the official Twitter account for House of Cards, posted on Thursday. Was Thursday April 1st?
Wednesday was April 1st, so
Let me
probably
just see
safe.
the Twitter message.
Da, 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 da.
Posted on the 2nd of April, you cynical person. Season 4 coming 2016.
Okay, I don't feel so bad because that was not revealed until now. And I have been working on this precipice because they confirmed season 3, I think, before season 2 aired or something like that.
Yeah, I think it depends on the download count, doesn't it, really, when you get to this point?
Yeah.
Are they going to just fall? Because it must be very expensive to produce. I think if
this
that
totally screws with my theories, though, because now you have to find a way to rev back up from that plot, like where they left off, and that's going to be hard, in my opinion.
Oh, I think the political drama aspects, it's going to be very hard, and I think it's almost irretrievable. So they're going to have shifted it to the emotional side of things.
Well, one of the interesting things about American politics is the elections are almost more interesting than the policy, or that's not a controversial thing to say. But the news media, watch CNN during an election year. They are happy people to be able to put on those fancy maps and have something to talk about. Besides, here's the Healthcare Reform Act. Here's 2 angry people to yell at each other about it. When do we vote again? Like, they'll cover gubernatorial elections in New Jersey as national news just to be able to show those maps. So maybe House of Cards will find a way of converting those kinds of, the actual horse race into really interesting drama. But I haven't seen a television series ever really make an election an interesting thing, because it's just like, here's our poll numbers, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I suppose we haven't seen who he's fighting against, have we?
The initial opponent was the Republican senator leader, but he had a fundraising problem, so he got kicked out midway season and replaced by a very square-faced gentleman with slicked back hair.
Yeah, so I guess there's a mechanism by which you could have him facing off against a very interesting character to inject excitement next year. Or just Claire run as an independent. I mean, that would be so cheesy. If they do something awful,
the worst.
That would just be horrific. In fact,
if Claire ran, though, for a position, because this is kind of the major point, right? If you're comparing Claire to Hillary Clinton, in our countries, legitimacy is confirmed through election. Being appointed to a major position confers upon you no legitimacy or very little legitimacy.
Indeed, but in that respect, neither Frank and Claire are equal on those grounds.
Right. So if Claire were to run to be, the senator for Maryland or whatnot, at least then she has something to stand on. Even if she does it as an independent, which is a slight against Frank, who is a Democrat.
Right.
But Frank, the question is, like, do they even bother with the Democratic primary in the next season? Or do they just say, well, I beat Heather Dunbar? They've been very happy to hand wave periods of time away in the show.
Yeah, I think they need to go through the primaries. Or do they? Because isn't that what's interesting about US general elections?
Well, the primary would be interesting, except Frank has really crappy opponents. Like, Heather Dunbar, I think, is an intellectually interesting opponent. Mm-hmm. But as a character, she's not very dynamic for Frank.
I just fall asleep when she's on the screen. I really could not give 2 shits.
And Jackie Sharp is out of the election, so now the Iowa caucus has occurred, and there's only 2 candidates.
Which is a shame, because that was a much more interesting character, I feel. But,
yeah, so, is there even a point unless you introduce someone else who jumps in late? But then again, you need to, as my political nerd...
They could have an assassination, and then Claire could, reluctantly run against whoever is Frank's sweep. And
see, maybe that's it. They'll actually finish season 3 at the beginning of season 4, like they did with season 1, and they'll kill Frank.
An assassination. Yeah, exactly.
And then the Democrats will say, well, we want you, Mrs. Underwood. You're very popular.
Yeah.
Da, 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 da. I don't know how I would feel about that show because I don't have a close emotional attachment with Claire. I think I've sympathized too much with Frank over time. I'm not saying Frank is a good guy in any way, but when he makes the point of, there's only one chair, you knew this all along. He's given her plenty of chances. She's made plenty of mistakes herself. I see it as equally exploiting each other. So my sympathies for Claire is limited, so I'm not sure how much I would like a season where she is the main character.
I wonder if... I think that when they started season 1, they knew they'd get 2 seasons regardless of the viewership.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking season 3... You're saying they renewed it almost immediately, so maybe season 3 was always planned, but I wonder if season 4 really was contingent on just seeing whether the viewership held up and whether they really truly planned for it. In the way that D&D have planned for Game of Thrones over 7 seasons, they know what their arc is. It's going to be fascinating, I think. It's not an easy show for them to write for next season.
It is very difficult, and
but this is why we're not writers, right? Because we don't have that imagination. Maybe they're going to hit it out of the park.
I'm an amateur writer.
Oh yeah, that's true. You do write. What kind of stuff do you write? Do you write political stuff?
In the way that everything is political, yes,
but not.
I give a shot at political fiction, but I've never actually gotten my hands around a story that I could get off the ground very well.
You should write political fiction because so few people actually know politics to write it well.
I think the main problem with political fiction is that politics isn't... I'm not saying it's not exciting. It's just the regular conflict between, the various parties and between politicians aren't very interesting. Right now in Canada, we're having kind of a dramatic series of debates in this country about kind of what the future is. And in the wake of ISIS terrorism, the government has introduced a fairly draconian piece of legislation to expand police powers. Mm-hmm. Like that could be really good fodder for some work of fiction. But in general, we're arguing over railroad safety, literally.
Maybe that's just the proud and sovereign state of Canada. I mean, I feel that UK politics is pretty dramatic. Like, one of my earliest memories is Margaret Thatcher getting knifed during the original airing of House of Cards, actually. And that was absolute grand theatre. At the premiere. Yeah, that was grand theatre. The Scottish referendum, that was pretty grand. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's just UK.
I mean, Canadian politics is kind of one of those... Maybe I'm just being a humble Canadian in that, we have major separatist movements in this country. We've had domestic terrorism in this country. We had Mayor Ford of Toronto. Like, that whole political drama unfolded in real time.
So there you go, dude.
Great shame. Like, yeah, there's lots of fodder in this country. It's just,
Get to it. Come on.
Get to it.
Like George R. R. Martin. Start writing.
Yes, ma'am.
That is the appropriate response. Okay. Well, now that I have asserted my political authority over the proud and sovereign domain of this podcast, unless you have anything else burning to say, shall we wrap up on House of Cards? Any points, any desperately keen insights that you didn't get a chance to make?
I was shocked that Doug lived, and I liked him as a character, even though he's really dark and disturbing.
I love Doug. Doug just seems like he's in a show of his own, like a dark psychological thriller that's all to himself.
Yeah, he's some sort of weird spliced in part from Breaking Bad in the middle of House of Cards.
He really is. Or Fargo.
And I think, again, this is one of the weaknesses of the show, is they started off with such a small cast of really good characters. They've attritioned away a few of them, and every time they try to introduce someone else, it falls flat.
Exactly.
Like Seth. Like the various reporters after Zoe.
Or even, like this Kate Bartlett character who just sleeps with the biographer, which is so obvious it's going to happen. Or Heather Dunbar, who I find utterly dull. Even Seth, what is the aim? What is the purpose of his Machiavellian nature? And
improving eyeliner, clearly.
And then at the end of season 2, when Claire and Frank have the threesome with Meacham, and I thought at some point, apart from being wonderfully rhyming, that has to have implications, right? Like, why would they do that? Why would they open themselves up to blackmail? But I don't know. Like, yeah, they don't seem to be able to shift tone or direction with any of these characters.
Mm-hmm. And it leaves it feeling very even small things like the Secretary of State, whose name currently escapes me. Um, no, I can't remember. She
Oh, Linda
gets so
Vasquez?
no, that's the former chief of
Oh, I
staff.
know who you mean. Yeah.
Like Claire
Durant.
manipulates her so easy, and it makes it make her look like a total mark. And it's like you're a sophisticated, intelligent woman. We've seen that
Yeah,
over
you're
and
meant to
over
be the
in the show.
Madeleine Albright, right? I mean, like, is this really gonna happen?
Like she's supposed to be the Hillary Clinton, the like, or the Condoleezza Rice. Americans are very favorable towards female secretaries of state lately.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, like a powerful, informed counterweight to Frank on foreign policy. And here we're playing beer pong. Like I thought that was a fun, charming scene, but like where was she the rest of the season? It's especially when foreign policy is supposed to be the main issue. The writers really need to reassess how they introduce and maintain their characters. And we've lost some of my favorite. Like Freddy was probably my favorite secondary character in the show, and they tried to bring him back and they just failed.
I just don't think it's ever really covered from the death of Pete Russo, actually, as a kind of as a heart to the story.
And really, there's not a lot of characters who get their own screen time. Like Peter Russo got his own like backstory, what he's going through, his kids, his relationship with Christina, his campaign. A lot of these other characters have no like if the main characters aren't in the room with them, they don't exist.
Mm.
And that's a problem. You know, that's why Doug's arc was so interesting because he started to like gradually get more and more attention of what he's doing out there on the world on his own until season 3 where it's like this is Doug being a crazy murdering guy.
Exactly. Yeah. Psycho voyeur.
I read this in your blog and I wonder if you missed it. You do know he killed Rachel at the end of the season, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. The way it was written in your blog, I was like, oh no, did Bina miss that part?
Did I not write it?
It was just it sounded a little vague, like you weren't sure if you actually did it.
Well, these
I could be
days, unless
imagining
I see a
things.
total chain of evidence, I like to inject a little bit of ambiguity, but I think that one is definitely a kill.
That could be any brunette being covered in desert dust in Arizona.
Yeah, but Quentin is alive. I'm very skeptical.
Till I see a corpse.
Exactly, a chain of
It's
evidence.
DNA evidence.
Yeah, but
Something
no,
that
I
was
think
holed
Rachel
up at
is
the
dead.
RCMP.
I think Rachel's dead, and it's crucial for Doug that she is. It's crucial for Doug's been through the underworld this season, the netherworld, and he needs to emerge now.
Again, but here's another example. Rachel, who was a pretty interesting character in previous seasons, or even I think in season 3 she's pretty interesting as well. Like now she's gone. So
yeah, but they had to have her gone.
Absolutely.
By rights, she should have gone at the end of season 2. It was actually a weakness that they kept her alive. It was such a sort of hokey way of like just avoiding getting rid of someone interesting.
I think so too.
So pull their punches quite literally.
Boom.
It sounds kind of like we're not in a good place with House of Cards at the end of this, even though I've really enjoyed it.
I definitely season 1 remains remarkably good television.
Yep.
Because that climb up the greasy ladder to power can't help but be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's why the drug kingpin movies are always so good. Tony Montana becoming a kingpin. That's a great sequence to watch, no matter what. I'm just glad there wasn't a montage in House of Cards that I can remember. But it's the mechanics of what do you do once you get your hero, quote unquote, in power. What do you do with that? And I think like all writers, they're struggling with that problem now.
Yeah, I agree. Oh well, on that rare note of unity and consensus, we should bid the dear viewer goodbye and hope that they have enjoyed what I have found to be quite an insightful and kind of I've definitely thought about it in different ways and rethought about it. I think the perils of binge watching is it can feel so intense when you're doing it, and then you sort of it doesn't sink in as if you ruminate over something week by week. So it's kind of been fun to go over it and sort of really pull apart some of its flaws, and yeah, it's been good. So thank you very much to Stephen for joining in.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome. Anytime you want to discuss political TV. Sadly, there's not enough of it, really. But
we could talk about party animals. That's a BBC one I watched. I actually like that.
Oh, okay. Have you ever seen the thick of it though?
I wrote that down when you were mentioning it, so I'm going to watch that or try to find it.
Yeah, that'll be fascinating to see what you think of that. And Malcolm Tucker is my hero. Just
Have you watched Borgen? I think it's pronounced Borg, but it's the Danish series about the woman who becomes prime minister.
Yes, I have.
I thought that would be a really good series to adapt for Canada because the stakes in the politics are very similar. There's the fourth episode in season 1 with the relationship with Greenland parallels Canada's relationship with northern people very nicely.
Okay.
I'm secretly advocating for that adaptation.
Well, don't secretly advocate. Take to Twitter, get Netflix to do
it. Yeah, Netflix will never originally create anything just for Canada, but I appreciate the thought.
Well, one can but try. Cool. Okay, well, thanks for listening, guys, and yeah, Posse out.
But no, there's tons of weird stuff. Let me share weird anecdotes. One of the first times I was here, I was walking to work, and what had to be every dog in town was howling for some reason. In the winter, I think it was November, I was walking home from work, and I pulled out my headphones, and there were dozens and dozens of ravens sitting on the power lines and the buildings, walking like along the street I was in.
That's spooky.
Yeah, and they make wonderful sounds.
You basically live north of the wall.
That's what I've been saying. And this winter, a pack of wolves moved into town. And they picked off a family's dog.
Oh my God.
And a couple had to run into a person's house because one was tracking them down the street.
No.
Yes.
Fuck.
And one of the wolves was captured when it picked up a person's dog and got trapped into someone's backyard. And the Department of Natural Resources came by and killed them. And they had to kill all those wolves because they had moved into a human community. Relocating them just doesn't work. The main character of the piece is a joke, right?
But he's dead.
Yes, he is dead. But he's also like laughably wrong.
I think the problem is not even that he was a joke, it's the fact that Werner it's the contrast of him versus the sensible, say, Parks people, and then this kind of Werner Herzog kind of...
Please never to listen to this video. It will give you terrible nightmares.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the guy's going, I think like man can live with nature and be all soft and fly. And he's like, I, on the other hand, think that nature is brutal and vicious,
Right. Thomas Hobbes was correct in his characterization of life on this planet.
Yeah, exactly.
And Mother Nature is its ultimate embodiment.
Yeah, exactly.
No, and that's kind of my philosophy. Well, let's just say I have deep respect for Saruman, and I might be hanging out a little bit at the Orthanc. It's like Denmark trying to patrol the Baltic Sea and saying it's Danish waters. Like, we're just kind of outmanned here.
Okay.
Except it's worse because I don't know if you've looked at a map, but our country is really fucking big. And that's a big waterway with incredibly
I only look at those maps that make England look really big, like the ones that make Europe look big and everyone else looks small.
Some serious Mercator projection distortion.
Yeah, exactly. That's all our ego can take. Now that
right.
We no longer rule everybody. Are you literally living in the Arctic Circle?
No. But not that far away from it either.
Oh my God. Yeah, especially you. I sort of picture you in sort of a log cut cabin in the Arctic Circle, miles from town. Like it's sort of like a shining overlook hotel type scenario. Oh,
I
dear.
wish I could say your depiction was terribly wrong, but you know, it's got you're hitting on the house two doors down from me is made of logs.
No.
Yes, because it's a lot of like, hey guys, it's a bison in the highway. I live in a place where there are herds of bison.
England's rural, but
England's rural, where a town of 3,400 people is a village. Yes, England's very rural.
we're rural, but we're realistic. We don't have delusions of grandeur.
It's not delusions of grandeur, it's acknowledgement of where there's civilization in a vast and mighty hinterland.
Well, I don't think you should be called a town unless you have a cinema, and you wouldn't have a cinema if you just had 3,400 people.
But the town with 3,400 people does have the cinema. It's a town with 2,400 people that doesn't.
Oh, Jesus.
They did once. That was a long time ago.
Have you read the new Winds of Winter chapter?
I did.
What did you think?
I really, really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
My big takeaway, and I remarked about this on the forums, and I don't think anyone else pointed it out, so I feel it's my observation. I get to claim it. Is it's hugely different tonally from a lot of the other chapters we've been getting. You know, compare it to anything in Feast for Crows or Dance with Dragons or Storm of Swords. It seems much happier and upbeat. It almost feels like Game of Thrones chapters, or I compared it to Dunk and Egg. It has a lot of the same. Like, you're in this world. Is it great? No, but there's kind of like light humor sprinkled throughout the chapter too.
Yeah, interesting stuff happening. It's I wonder if some of the previous spoiler chapters that we've had were written concurrent with Feast Dance, and therefore the whole Merry's Not thing, and that maybe this is one of the fresh chapters, and that's why it's just written with him in a totally different, non-traumatized mindset. Because it does, you're right, it does feel different, doesn't it? And I just wonder how much of the old stuff was just recycled, whereas this is kind of genuinely in the new post-Feast Dance writing phase. So I was kind of excited. It's kind of cool to see Harry the Heir and Sansa.
Even
Kind
if
of
he was a
creepy,
total jerk.
creepy to see middle. Well, is he though?
Harry the Heir.
Yeah, I mean, if you had Rob at the beginning, or take someone that we like, and if he had been presented with some illegitimate daughter of a lesser house to marry, don't you think he would have had the same kind of "Ugh, I don't want to marry her" kind of thing?
But Rob did marry a
Yeah, but
kind of
I mean,
sideline
only because he
minor house.
fancied the pants off her, which Harry will get to shortly.
Certainly seems that way. Enough spice for you, my lord.
I know,
My
that was so weird.
goodness.
And yet his tummy's still a fluttering, so I wasn't quite sure. I think outside of the context, it's hard to see whether that's bad, kind of inconsistent characterization, or it's just that Sansa's on kind of on either side of sexual maturity or something. But it's like seeing Littlefinger kind of groom her, like he did with Roz in the TV show early on. It's just so horrible, like giving her
Uh,
specific instructions on how to seduce someone. Ugh.
yeah, I don't. I really like the little. I like my favorite characters in the series are the I had categorized them as the schemers. I really like Littlefinger and Varys and Prince Doran. Like, they're not great people in any way, but I think they're the most interesting because they're off-screen shuffling events around that we don't know about.
It makes so much sense because you're into politics, so it's yeah.
Yep. Um, so I maybe to a fault overlook Littlefinger's creepiness. So I didn't have, because that's politics for a medieval house, right? Like, make yourself charming, and it goes back to Sansa's old refrains of a lady's courtesy is her armor and all that. Like, yeah, flirt with the boy, make him interested.
It really reminded me of what it must have been like for, is it Norfolk, Anne Boleyn's uncle and her father, who were like sort of almost deliberately pimping out Mary and Anne Boleyn to Henry VIII. And it can't
I
have
think
been.
that's correct.
It can't have
Again,
been that.
English history, I'm a little rusty on.
Yeah, but it can't have been that dissimilar. I mean, this stuff must have actually happened. You know, we need preferment, so make sure we'll just put yourself in the path of Henry VIII and make sure that when he really wants you, you give him the cold shoulder. I mean, I'm sure this stuff actually happened.
Right.
So
I haven't read it yet, but from what I understand, George and his writing companions imitated that exactly with the Aegon the Unworthy. You know, basically every lord with a pretty daughter would bring him around the king to try to end up becoming the hand or hugely powerful or influential. Yeah, that's all in there. It's very much ripped, but I mean, isn't it the Earl of Woolwich? I don't know how it's pronounced. He did the same thing in a
Woolwich?
different. Yeah, it wasn't like his daughter was this prize going between feuding royal houses. It's all blur.
Yeah.
I read too much of this stuff all at once, so I can't keep various phases of the War of the Roses clear in
the
my
War of the
head.
Roses is hard though. That is hard to keep straight. And I did it.
I listened to your podcast about it.
But we were getting confused all the way through too. I mean, that was no guide.
I mean, I've probably read those Wikipedia articles now half a dozen times, and every time I read it, I think, oh, okay, it all makes sense, sure. But then it just sieves out of my brain. There's no way to keep track of it in any sense.
Unless,
because it's all just so abstract.
You should try doing a live Twitter feed of the Wars of the Roses. It's a pretty good way to force yourself to get history in its right order. I'm discovering with the cross I have given myself over Waterloo.